This video will contain spoilers for, whoa, it's just one game in the series, and it's not even Xenoblade 3. This is a Xenoblade 2 only video. It's just spoilers for that in Torna. Isn't that kind of weird? Now, you may be asking, shouldn't the video about the Xenoblade fictional month that ends in Tober have been released in the real month that ends in Tober? Yes, you are probably correct. But also, shut up. November also ends in BER, and that's close enough for me. If you didn't know, at the beginning of Xenoblade 2 Chapter 3, Rex is using a Cloud Sea compass to try and find out where the different Titans are, and he asks Pyra what the date is, and she responds that it is Amathatober 5th, 4058. And the big thing about this is, if you were playing with Japanese audio, you might notice that she does not say Amathatober. Not only was the name of the month different in English or Japanese, but the made-up month name in its entirety is an invention for the dub. I'm not actually going to get into a big localization discussion this time because we're going to take the video in a very stupid direction instead, but I do want to touch on why this change was made. This is how the date is written in the Japanese subtitles, and if you want to translate those kanji directly in a very stupid way, you'll get something like 5th sun of the 9th moon of the year 4058, which obviously is not an accurate translation and why something like localization is needed in the first place. That being said, even a poor localization of the game wouldn't have translated this line like that, because this is just more or less the standard date format in written Japanese. It's written year, month, day, and if you know some basic kanji, you might notice that moon is used for month and sun is used for day, which makes sense given where the concept of months and days first came from. Now, the reason we have an Amathatober specifically is because while the months do have proper poetic kanji names in Japanese, by far the more common way to refer to them is as they're written in this date, with the number either written using the kanji for that number or the Arabic numeral, and then the kanji for moon or month. So instead of January, February, March, etc., it would just be Ichigatsu, Nigatsu, Sangatsu, all the way to Junigatsu for December. Normally in localization, that's not a big deal whatsoever. Okay, it's the 5th day of the 9th month. That's called September 5th. You can directly translate that. The problem arises, though, when we're in a fictional world with no direct connection to real-world Earth culture because of the origin of the name September. It comes from the Latin word for 7, because it used to be the 7th month of the Roman calendar. So when in Japanese, the name for the month is just 9th month, and in English, while it is also derived from a number, September is more of a proper name. What do you do in a world so far in the future no one knows any Earth languages, so there's no way they would realistically give the name September to that month? There are kind of three options you could go there. Firstly, you could just say 9th moon or something close to that in English, directly translating a different reading of the same kanji used for month that is similar enough to colloquial phrases in current English where a reasonable person familiar with the language and culture would be able to figure out what that means. This is sort of similar to what Final Fantasy XIV does, as its calendar is also 12 months, and even in English they're simply numbered 1st astral moon, 1st umbral moon, etc. unto the 6th of each. You could just leave it as is, as September, because if you think about it, Rex's name also comes from Latin, and that's the same in all languages, so there's some suspension of disbelief regardless regarding old languages. This is what localizations of the Trails series do. While they do tend to try and leave the date in numerical format as much as possible, in every game in the series there's at least a few instances of a real-world English name for a month being used, and you just kind of have to accept that as part of your suspension of disbelief that the months are just called the same thing they are in the real world, despite the world of that series having absolutely zero connection to it. The third option is what they decided to go with in the end, which is make up a new month name that sounds similar enough to a real-world one, where you can tell that it's supposed to be a month, but is also informed by the history and culture of the fictional world, similar to how all of that has shaped the names of the months we use today. So in the case of the 9th month of the year in the All-Rest calendar in Xenoblade 2, they took Tober from the real-world October, which doesn't make any sense if you think about it. The octo part of October is 8, because it used to be the 8th month, and then it's now the 10th month, but they made it the 9th month for some reason instead of just using Amathatober. But either way, the Amath part appears to be from the name of Amalthus. Okay, that's all well and good. We know that the name of the month was technically changed in the English version. We can figure out why it was changed. So instead of getting in a big stupid argument about whether or not the change should have been made, let's analyze everything we can about the date Amathatober 5th, 4058, and see if this was a good change in the sense of it being a date that could realistically exist with the historical and cultural context of Allrest at the time of the main game of Xenoblade 2. First off, there being a 5th day of the month, I think, is the part of the date we can completely ignore. This doesn't really tell us anything. I don't know any even fictional calendars that have months that have less than 5 days in them, so that much we can easily accept at face value. Next up, Amathatober is the 9th month of the Allrestian calendar in the Japanese version. This means that said calendar has at least 9 months in it, and since they just used the standard Japanese date system with no real significant changes, I think it's not unreasonable to assume that Allrest also uses a 12-month calendar like the one we're all familiar with. This too is not a surprise. It would be weirder if Allrest did not use some form of 12-month calendar simply because of the whole post-apocalyptic Earth thing. If Earth's sun and moon are still up there in the sky, moving like how they do currently, then just like countless cultures in the real world that did it independently, people are going to look up and start marking time by those. Likely coming up with either a solar calendar based on how long it takes for the sun to return to the same position in the sky, a lunar calendar based on the phases of the moon, or a lunisolar calendar like the one we have now that takes both into account. It's perfectly reasonable if you come up with a calendar that has a year length in the 360s like ours to divide it up into smaller chunks to make it less cumbersome and easier to figure out exact dates of things. And even if the year length is purely based on the sun, the moon is also up there in the sky, the same place the sun you're looking at to mark that is, so it's a natural thing to think of when you're thinking of ways to divide the year. So, as long as something similar to Earth's night sky is out there, a calendar with 12 months is completely reasonable. Then, and this is probably going to be the biggest deal for the rest of the video, the names of the months themselves. Is it reasonable for Amalthus to get a month with his name on it? Well, let's compare to the 2 months we use today that we know as a fact are named after real people, July and August, both of which were named after guys you've probably heard of who went by the name Gaius Julius Caesar. Yes, we actually have to think about the Roman Empire in this Xenoblade video. Now, all memes aside, we would probably be touching on this at least a little bit, as long as the video topic was calendars to some degree, because Julius Caesar oversaw the creation of a calendar that's so close to the one we still use today that even over 2,000 years later, it's off by less than 2 weeks. If you're thinking that Allrest is so far behind the real world in terms of population, level of technology, and interconnectedness, keep in mind, part of the reason Caesar needed to introduce such calendar reform at the time in the first place is because he was also the guy responsible for overseeing the upkeep of that kind of thing, and he just hadn't dealt with that for a while. So, ordinarily, the calendar that they'd had for hundreds of years even before then would have been working better. And the reform Caesar introduced in 45 BC lasted without a major widely accepted reform until 1582, and the 1582 version is what we're using now. And while it isn't perfect, the drift of the current calendar is on a scale of thousands of years, and the only reason we've noticed stuff like that is because we've gotten so good at astronomy, we've noticed things like relativity and the rate at which the speed of the Earth's rotation is slowing. Bana has access to video calls without using blade technology, and cartographers are good enough where they can create the Cloud Sea Compass Rex uses, where just by knowing that it's Amathatober 5th, he can tell what the closest titan to the world tree is. So, I'm pretty sure they've got a handle on enough to make at least a Julian calendar equivalent. All that being said, is Amalthus influential enough in Allrest where he could get a month named after him? To start, the name of July was changed to be in honor of Julius Caesar after his assassination, while August was named after Augustus while he was still alive, but after he'd already become the first emperor. So I guess the question kind of remains, since Amalthus is clearly still alive after the name Amathatober has been used, is he on an Augustus Caesar level of relevance and importance? The fact that he's alive for 500 plus years definitely helps that, and, well, you know, he is in fact the Pope. That's probably a big deal. And yeah, now that we're talking about Amalthus in his religious capacity, we would have had to bring up Rome again, because Indal is inspired by organized Christianity in general, and the Roman Catholic Church in very particular, and in fact, he starts out as a quaestor of Indal and Torna and ends up as the leader, the praetor, in the main game, both of which were titles in the Roman Republic's government, which long predates both the Empire and the Catholic Church. Not only is the praetor of Indal an extremely powerful position, but Amalthus is exceptional even by standards of that. Per the intro to Torna, we know that it is currently the year 3564, and Radalis, the praetor Amalthus assassinates, is the 107th. We're going to get back to the year numbering system later, but assuming that the first praetor took office about the same time as the year numbering starts, that's an average of a 33-year reign per praetor, which actually tracks with the long lifespan of the Indaline. Based on Radalis, it does seem like, similar to real Catholic popes, praetors tend to take office at a relatively old age, so they might not stay there very long, even if the position is for life. The average real-world papal reign is 7 to 8 years, so a quarter the length of the 33-year average of praetors, and that 33-year average, not upper bound, if given to a real pope, would be the second longest in the history of the Catholic Church, only behind the actual Saint Peter himself. And then we have Amalthus reigning for 494 years as the 108th praetor after all of that. Oh, and just in case you thought we were only referencing Christianity with all this, 108 is an important number in Hinduism and Buddhism, so do with that what you will. I don't even know where that starts to factor into all this. But if we really want to make the full Augustus Amalthus comparison, we can kind of just take any arbitrary 500 years of the existence of the Catholic Church or the Roman Empire and compare Amalthus and Indal's influence over the world of Alrest to that. And just what is the influence of Indal over Alrest? Well, it seems more or less absolute. There's clearly a lot of nation-sized titans that we don't see in the story of Xenoblade 2, there are even a few that are mentioned directly across the main game in Torna, but they seem to all still be under the purview of Indal. The Praetorium is capable of stopping a war before it starts simply by showing up. It's considered the neutral ground for diplomatic debates between the most powerful other nations in Alrest. Indal controls the flow of core chips. It has Tantal completely under its thumb despite it ostensibly being an independent nation. It's responsible for cleansing core crystals and handling the registration of drivers, the most powerful combatants in the world. Indal can even control armies that way. It has access to knowledge and technology from old Judicium, and based on a couple scenes from Torna, even hoards the most functional technology from the land of Moritha that was dredged up by salvagers for itself. Theoretically, Tantal is so far under its thumb that the praetor could probably order them to give Indal the Omega Fetter, and they'd probably just straight up have access to Ophion as well. They've even been experimenting with Flesh Eaters and Blade Eaters for centuries, so even if another power got its hands on a lot of core crystals under Indal's nose, they'd still have their own, even more elite combatants to take on swaths of potential enemy drivers. Based on the assault on the World Tree, even non-driver Indaline soldiers and Titan weapons are extremely powerful and probably would put to shame any other military in Alrest if they actually had a reason to fight against them and weren't beholden to a non-intervention treaty that, yeah, Amalthus kind of breaks anyway in Chapter 5 and never faces repercussions for it. I'm assuming the overwhelming ubiquity of the Indaline Praetorium and its influence over just everyday life in Alrest is heavily inspired by the Catholic Church in medieval Europe. The thing is, though, Alrest is a much more insular, isolated, and probably lower population place than even a Europe of hundreds of years ago. Yeah, the Catholic Church was and still is extremely powerful, but even in the time period Indal's power and actions bring to mind, it's still nowhere remotely the same. We don't even know if there are other denominations of whatever the formal name of the religion Indal practices is, let alone other religions, period. Whereas the Great Schism in Christianity, splitting the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, happened during the Middle Ages. The Protestant Reformation happened right after. By the time most of Europe converted to Christianity, Islam had already long been established, so there would either still be a strong pagan presence or a caliphate touching a different shore of the Mediterranean. The Silk Road predated the beginning of the Middle Ages in Europe, so while the knowledge they had was often hilariously inaccurate, there were still people in Europe at the time who knew that places like India and China existed. And even Leif Erikson's rather important boat trip westward happened during the Middle Ages, and he's said to have converted to Christianity instead of being baptized as an infant, which was seemingly still a normal thing in the Norse world at the time. For as much as Europe-centered narratives about it being a backwards time are shoved down our throat, the entire rest of the planet did still exist at the time. A good chunk of it was known to so-called Christian Europe, and most of the people there weren't all concerned or knowledgeable about what was going on the day-to-day in Rome. It's nowhere remotely the same to how it is in Alrest. As far as we know, Indal's sphere of influence is the entire populated remainder of Earth. There might not be any Titans around the other two beanstalks, or anywhere not orbiting the World Tree, and those Titans circling the World Tree are all the purview of Amalthus and the Praetorium. You can take any pope in history and compare their influence over the world to Amalthus. It's not even remotely comparable with how much more influence Amalthus had. Even if you take it and limit it to not the entire planet, but to all of the world that would be known to an educated person in Rome at the time of that pope's reign, it's still nowhere near close to the hegemony that Amalthus, or probably even a lot of praetors before him, had over Alrest, considering the only thing that was able to kill Radalis was something from within Indal itself. And going back to Augustus and any other of the emperors, the Roman Empire had to do empire things, like conquering other places or fighting wars against other states or itself to maintain its position in the world, whereas Amalthus more or less spawned in on top and only tightened his grip over Alrest over time. The only thing the guy ever really had to fear with disrupting his reign over Alrest was another Aegis War, and he got most of the way through that as well, with everything going basically according to Keikaku, so I don't think there's really any comparison to the real-world inspirations. The position Julius Caesar had that gave him responsibility for maintaining the calendar in Rome was the Pontifex Maximus, the chief religious official of then the Roman Republic. And the Gregory who the Gregorian calendar is named after was Pope Gregory the 13th. So the last two people to change the calendar were a pope and the 0th emperor of the Roman Empire, and we're already saying Amalthus had more influence than both of those offices. Amalthus himself wouldn't even need to do anything with getting a month named after him. Anyone under him could just propose a motion for the Praetorium to formally recognize the 9th month of the year as Amathatober in honor of the current praetor's long reign or achievements towards peace in Alrest or anything like that. He probably didn't need to lift a finger himself beyond giving a rubber stamp. Any underling who wanted to suck up to him and had some sort of influence in Indal's government could have done something like that without Amalthus prompting anything. I don't even know if it's particularly in character for Amalthus to want a month named after him, but he got one just because of how powerful he was. Okay, so we've accepted the 5th day of the month being a completely rational thing. We've established that Amalthus getting a month named after him makes absolute perfect sense, even if that was not part of the intent of the original Japanese version of the scene. Let's talk about the year 4058 and how that's the year Xenoblade 2 takes place in, because having a calendar is one thing. That tells you when it's the next year, but the way the years are numbered also can tell a lot about the society that uses that calendar. This is especially interesting because the beginning of Torna, which takes place before Amalthus's major rise to power, gives a year using the same numbering system, as the one used in not just English but Japanese as well in the main game. The base game is in 4058, and Torna and the Aegis War are in 3564, meaning that it's actually been 494 years and not an exact round 500 in between the two projects. Now, this is actually a piece of world building I like a lot. There's no prophecy, no fated anything going on with Malos being revived and that starting up the second Aegis War in the quest to Elysium, so it shouldn't be a complete round number. But I also just like how all of the characters do the completely normal thing and round it up to 500 to make it sound more impressive. Even the people who were there for the original war, and even the ones who are literally computers. It's just a nice little detail that makes all of this funny anime stuff seem slightly more realistic, because the way it's written is absolutely how real people would refer to it, and it would seem off if everyone just kept saying, ah yes, this was 494 years ago, or if the date was in exact round 500. Anyway, what exactly happened 3,564 years before Amalthus ever rose to power that got Indal to start numbering years that way? I think it's fairly reasonable to assume that Indal is also responsible for administering the calendar, seeing as how Amalthus, a praetor, and as far as we know, no emperors of Moradane or anything like that ever got months named after them, and that there's no real international secular authority that would make sense to have any sort of power over something like that. The trade guilds come close, and in their operations, obviously knowing the date and time very well would be extremely important. However, they're at most a loose federation, and there are tons of rivalries between them, so I don't think it would be good for stability if one individual trade guild was responsible for setting the calendar, so it makes sense for none of them to do that, which just brings us back to Indal, which means that the year numbering specifically is likely done for religious and not historical reasons, which now means that we have to think about things that might have happened 3,564 years before the start of Torna. I'm guessing that it's not related to the life and times of any specific important person on Allrest, as it doesn't seem like the Indaline religion is based around any central figure like that and doesn't really have a prophet or the like. Now, yes, that is a major difference from the actual Christianity that inspires it, but let's just think for a second. Amalthus went up the world tree, found where the architect lived, and came back with 2 Aegis cores. So, in addition to being Pope for 500 years and background Emperor of the world for probably close to that, he's also kind of the closest thing the Indaline religion has to a prophet figure, at least in the Abrahamic sense, especially because he awoke the Logos core, which represents the sun in the Trinity processor. Despite that though, the numbering system not only predates Amalthus, but also wasn't changed after he rose to power, and while we're given information about a bit of the history of the Indaline Praetorium, it's kind of hard to think of anyone more important to the religion overall as Amalthus, so it's unlikely that in the past the numbering system was based on someone like that, if it wasn't changed around Amalthus. I've referenced Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam all before in this video, so just think about all 3 of those. 2023 is 2023 because that's how many years it's been since some priest in the 500s thought Jesus was born. The multiple Buddhist calendars start numbering from when the Buddha achieved enlightenment, and the Islamic calendar starts numbering from the year Muhammad emigrated to a different city, which was important in both his life and the spread of the faith. So I'm pretty sure they would have reset the numbering around Amalthus unless the year 0 for the calendar is based around something more important than any individual person. The only person who I think could be as influential to Indal and the religion as a whole as Amalthus would be the original Praetor, but at that point, if you're going to number based around that person's life, then just count from the founding of the Indaline Praetorium itself, which is a very distinct possibility. That's already what I assumed when I calculated the average Praetor reign earlier in the video, and it just kind of makes sense. It's going to be built around either an important year for the culture or development of the Indaline Praetorium as an institution, or something related to the actual doctrine of the religion, like that's when something specific to the mythology was supposed to have happened. plenty of calendars around the world when they didn't use regnal numbering like how the Roman Republic defined years by which consuls were in power, or the still commonly used Japanese system of eras based around the current emperor at the time, based the numbering around that culture's beliefs about the beginning of the world. And at first, you would think that, okay, maybe that's the numbering since humanity was said to have been cast out of Elysium, which, as far as we can tell, is not an actual thing that happened. Humanity re-evolved again on the Titans, but I'm pretty sure they'd have at least vaguely recorded history for longer than 3,500 years, and with salvagers being a thing, they'd probably actually have a decent archaeological institution in place, and would be able to tell that, yes, this isn't a thing from the land of Moritha, this is from an old Titan nation from however long ago that just happens to massively predate anything in the present time that we've actually gotten to hear about. And that's just simply because of the level of civilization that's been achieved. It's not just that they're built up to levels and have technology on the tier of stuff that we can reasonably picture, even if it's not quite up to the present day, but there's also the fact that there are multiple sentient species in Alrest that have a combined civilization together. And blades exist. While yes, I think all evolution in Alrest was sped up compared to how it would have been in the original Earth, simply because core crystals are computers based on data from evolution in the real world, there's also the fact that we know drivers and blades changed a lot over history, and blades actually evolved to have weapons, which is a level of biological evolution that overwhelmingly surpasses the amount that's been seen in Homo sapiens since we invented civilization. So, even if proper recorded history or writing isn't that old, there's got to be traces of something resembling civilization from longer ago than that. Granted, it is basically a giant archipelago, so civilization might have come out of hunter-gatherers relatively quickly compared to the real world, just based on the fact that there's not a lot of roaming and nomadic stuff you can do when you're stuck on individual titans, so in order to do anything like that, you're gonna have to work together and create ships that can go between them, so that part is probably also accelerated, but I just don't buy that happening in under 3,500 years. This arguably also rules out any date related to mythological events for the Indaline religion, as the creation of Alrest and Elysium and humanity being cast out of Elysium are, again, by far the most significant events mentioned in anything related to the Indaline faith, which means that they wouldn't start the numbering from any lesser event, so it's got to be historical but not secular because it has to do with Indal itself. I've used the founding of the Praetorium as an example twice already, and this genuinely makes perfect sense. I would outright believe that if that were the case, but I think there is a slightly better option. And that's because people in Indal really like talking about how they're successors to Old Judicium. I'm betting, actually, that their calendar continues numbering from the calendar of Judicium, which is probably based around when that nation was founded. And I'd also kind of guess that the Praetors are numbering themselves after the chief religious officials from Judicium as well. We actually get a name drop for Meldinare, the founder of Indal, and presumably an early Praetor as well, who was the person who had gotten their hands on the original Aegis artifact Malos named himself after, and there's enough wiggle room, at least in the English version, where it's never said that they're the first Praetor. They'd be the first Praetor acting out of Indal, and the founder of the Praetorium. However, we don't know for sure they're the first in the numbering, because there could have easily been tens, if not dozens, of Judician Praetors beforehand. For probably very nationalistic reasons, at least among the clergy in Indal, being successors to Judicium is a very important part of the identity, so they would want to adopt the same calendar and some of the same institutions in a way to seem more legitimate and draw more continuity. This just kind of seems like a thing that they would do. It also kind of meshes well with the history we know, because Judicium working on early Flesh Eater technology and potentially being a rival to Torna in its full power just also kind of works. and I think ties together more with everything we've seen, and arguably, Amalthus would want Torna to be destroyed like it was in the Aegis War, because he'd view it as taking revenge for Judicium if it was something that lost to Torna in the past, and maybe how it fell and how Indal was founded in the first place. I know this all comes from a localization change, but it's really interesting to think about. And I think I'm going to leave you to think about that stuff, because until then, this is Luxon, signing off. Until the next video. Oh, and as for how Pyra knew the name Amathatober in the first place, despite it having to have been invented after she was sealed, she's the Aegis, she receives information from all blades. She shouldn't be able to speak the modern language in the first place after having been sealed for almost 5 centuries, so she knows it for the same reason she can communicate with literally anyone. I don't think that's a big deal or lore breaking in the slightest.